Hello. Thank you for clicking onto my presentation. I'm Luke Lawrence from Toyo University, and today I'm going to be talking about a study that I carried out looking into non-Japanese teachers' use of students L1 in the classroom. The use of Japanese in the classroom, basically, because it's based in Japan. Okay, so it's going to take you through a few different things. So first of all, we're going to look at language teacher identity, and then native speakerism in relation to that. From that, we're going to look at L1 use in the language classroom, and also emotions in language teaching, especially teacher emotions in language teaching. And after we've kind of gone through the literature, I'll take you through the study, give a little bit of data and my thoughts about it. So first of all, language teacher identity. Kind of recent ideas around teacher identity have taken on the postmodern, post-structuralist framework, which sees a teacher's identity as a non-essentialized, kind of fluid, dynamic phenomenon. So it's the idea that, you know, it's something that you do rather than this fixed thing that you are. And this study very much takes on board this post-structuralist thinking. There's also the socio-cognitive elements, the idea of humans as an emotional being, but also people that have ideological beliefs and how these emotions and ideologies feed into each other, or sometimes kind of battle against each other, which we'll talk about it a little bit later. Okay, next is native speakerism and CLT. So I think if you're watching this, you've probably got a good idea about what native speakerism is. It's very big in the literature these days, but I think so far there's been a very kind of the main focus seems to have been on the teacher themselves, like the so-called native speaker teacher or the so-called non-native speaker teacher. And a lot of the time people kind of forget the end part of Holliday's original definition, which also mentioned the discrimination based on language teaching methodology, which is kind of the main focus of this study. Although the people in the study are mainly, not all, but mainly so-called native speaker teachers. That's not really the focus. The focus is the kind of language teaching methodology, which is based on CLT. So, you know, Phillipson talked about this way back in '92, the idea of linguistic imperialism and how English language teaching spread around the globe. And one way it was able to do so was because we had this idea of English-only policies, and the idea that English only was the best way and the most effective way to learn English, when in reality, it was just a way for privileged native speaker teachers to basically go anywhere they wanted around the world without having to learn the local language first, which in previous times, perhaps they would have done so. So this kind of insertion of English only into CLT without any real basis for it has had very profound consequences. And one of these is kind of the suppression of individual skills and abilities. So, you know, just because you don't have to learn the local language anymore when you go somewhere to live and work and teach English. A lot of people do, and a lot of people do have these skills and abilities, and under CLT, and perhaps they are not able to fully enhance these skills and abilities that they may possess. So yeah, this brings us to use of L1 in the classroom. So a lot of institutions, workplaces, teaching centers have English-only policies. They've kind of been criticized in recent years, mainly because there's just no evidence that they're any better. There's no empirical evidence to suggest that they are effective in any way at all. There is evidence to kind of suggest that they may lead to kind of suppression of identity, which may lead to lack of expression, so more difficulty in learning the language. Also, in the last kind of decade or so, the idea of translanguaging has emerged. So if you're not familiar with translanguaging, just very, very briefly, it's just the idea that the kind of named languages, for example, English, or a named language such as Japanese, is kind of a social construct, and that all of these kind of different elements of so-called named languages exist in our brain as one overall linguistic repertoire, and that we should be encouraging ourselves and our students to draw on whatever elements of our linguistic repertoire that we can and that we need for that particular context at that particular time. And so that may include kind of mixing the languages together or drawing on whatever language is necessary at that point, which I personally fully support. Finally, then, emotions in language teaching. So in a recent edited book, Didios Martinez Agudo, he identifies emotion as an overlooked factor in English language teaching, especially for language teachers. There is a little bit of it in language learners, but not so much in language teachers. Benesh, around kind of 2012, 2013, she started writing about this, the idea of emotional labor and the complexity of the work that language teachers do. One aspect of it is confidence, bringing it back to the use of the language. So there are a few studies on this that I found, but they were all of so-called non-native speaker teachers that lacked the confidence in their own English ability as an English teacher, especially if they were placed alongside a so-called native English speaker teacher. So there are reports of very experienced and qualified non-native speaker teachers kind of freezing up in the presence of a newly, perhaps not particularly qualified native speaker teacher. But this study looks at the other side of that. This study looks at the confidence or lack of it of native speaker teachers to show that it does affect both groups. Well, all groups, let's say. I don't want to create that false dichotomy that I'm saying doesn't exist. So it does affect all kinds of people, and this leads to anxiety. So let's get into the study. The origins and inspiration. Basically, it just came from my own experience. I've been living in Japan a long time. I have kind of a limited Japanese ability, but I just found that I don't really use it in the classroom, and I don't know why. And I just wanted to find out if other people were similar to me and maybe shed some light on why. So there were 10 participants overall, 7 male, 3 female. I would have liked a better balance, but that's ELT teaching in Japan. It's a very gendered industry, mainly made up of males. There are 9 inner circle native English speaker teachers, and there was 1 non-Japanese, non-native English speaker in there as well, just to try to get a bit of see if there was any difference. I used a snowball recruitment style, so I reached out to a few people that I already knew, and they in turn recommended a few extra people, and I ended up with a nice round number of 10 participants. I interviewed them all face-to-face. I was lucky enough to get this in before the pandemic hit, and I used reflexive interviews. If you're not familiar with the idea of reflexive interviews, it's just, I can't remember the quote, I think Talmy calls it like a socially situated speech event. So you're using an interview as a kind of a conversation or a speech event rather than just this cold, austere kind of research instrument or something like that. There's also a kind of commitment to transparency, which really appeals to me. So, a lot of qualitative interview-based research has these kind of very juicy pull quotes that we all are surprised at and shocked at. And often, because we're kind of trying to keep to limited word counts, these are the only things that are seen out of context. Reflexive interviews tries to add a bit of transparency to that, to see the build-up to that juicy pull quote, and also to see the role of the interviewer in co-constructing that particular conversation that leads up to the interesting or revealing quote at the end. So unfortunately, due to limited screen time, I don't have that much of that in here, although it will be in the actual paper. So although I've tried to show kind of longer extracts of conversation as well. These were transcribed. I run them through NVivo and looked for kind of common themes, and 4 main themes emerged, which I will take you through now. First one is just language policy. So here is some quotes from the teachers. What I'm going to ask you to do for all of these parts is just to take a moment, just to pause the video and just read these, and then I'll come back and give my interpretation. So please pause for a moment and read. And one more, please pause and read. Okay, so as you can see here, there seems to be a general theme that most policies, most institutions did have English-only policies. And although there was a lot of, there was a kind of broad spectrum of how strict they were and how strict they were enforced, the main theme that came through for me was agreement and resistance. There was some agreement with some people very soundly and logically arguing why they agreed with it. But the main kind of tendency over the course of the 10 interviews was resistance towards these policies. At times it was open and direct resistance by basically saying directly to management that they would be using English in the classroom, even when they're being evaluated. But most of the time it was kind of behind closed doors, or it was kind of quietly resisting these policies. Okay, next is beliefs and ideology. Again, just pause and take a moment to read. And again. Okay, so the themes that came out here, basically the initial training seemed to be very, very powerful, I found. The initial training or the initial experiences, a lot of people started out working in a Kaiwa where strict English only policies were there. And the result of that seemed to be very, very powerful and still held sway over a lot of the participants, even though perhaps in their mind they kind of moved away from these initial beliefs. There's also the interesting example there from the second piece of data about ingrained beliefs was beneficial. The idea that, as I said at the beginning, Phillipson's idea that, you know, if you can go around the country and live comfortably here by kind of embracing this English only policy, then of course you're going to get on board and you're going to think it's a good thing. But what came through was basically a bit of a disparity between beliefs and practices. So a lot of people, a lot of the candidates that I spoke to kind of talked about how their beliefs had changed over the years, but their practice hadn't really. So they'd kind of intellectually disengaged from the idea that English only was the best way, but in practice, they still carried out largely English only classes. And it was interesting that the formal study seemed to be a catalyst both for attitude change, both for and against. So a few of the participants talked about how learning about world English is and things like that at like doing MAs, master's courses, led them away from this idea of English only. But other people said that it kind of, their training that they received at that higher education level reinforced their ideas of English only as well. So it seemed to work on both sides. Okay, the third theme is selective use of Japanese, or what Japanese was being used for. So, and how it was being used. So again, take a moment to pause and read. And one more. Okay, so the really interesting thing that I hadn't quite expected to come up was the idea that the Japanese that was being used was being used one-to-one with the students. And it was also being used outside of class, or sometimes like before class or after class, even though the students were still in the classroom, outside of those kind of strict confines of bell to bell. It seems that the teachers were more comfortable using Japanese. It was often used for humor. Now this goes into something which I don't have time to go into now, but this perhaps suggests all kinds of things to do with native speakerism and attitudes to perhaps race and all kinds of things which I go into in the paper, but I don't have time to come into here. The extracts I just showed you were kind of very focused on the idea that it was used to reduce student anxiety, stop them feeling scared and lost, and to help build relationships with students. But as I said, for me, the interesting thing that came out was the fact that it was one-to-one. So people were kind of comfortable just speaking quietly and chatting and helping before and after and quietly in their ear, but were not comfortable with standing at the front of the class and speaking in front of a whole class of people, who, all their eyes on you, and using Japanese language, which takes us to theme 4, which is anxiety. So there's just one data set here. It's a longer interview part with the same teacher. So just take a moment to pause and read that. Okay, so this extract had basically everything that came out of the other interviews as well. So a clear separation of inside and outside the classroom. So the idea that these teachers who live their lives in Japan were very comfortable outside the classroom, talking to their partners, spouses, friends, doctors, shop staff in Japanese. No problem at all. But when it came to inside the classroom, there seemed to be some kind of mental barrier that prevented them using Japanese. A lot of this was based on language level. A lot of people kind of downplayed their language level, it seemed to me. And there seemed to be a kind of a lack of confidence in their language ability. As I said in the previous part, so this kind of showed itself in the idea that one-to-one, people were kind of okay with it, but being able to stand in front of a class and even have the ability just to use, a few words of Japanese, it seemed to be something that was a mental barrier that was based on confidence, but also the idea that came up at the end of that extract there, which came up in a few other interviews as well, was this idea of loss of authority, which I found really interesting. It seems to suggest that by kind of exposing yourself to students as a poor language learner yourself, you're somehow diminishing yourself in the eyes of the students as a competent language teacher. The idea that how can the students respect you as a language teacher if they can see that you're not a very good language learner and that your Japanese is not as good as you think it should be. So this idea of the loss of authority in the classroom, which seemed to me to be based mainly on confidence and anxiety rather than the reality of people's Japanese level, was the kind of the main thing that came through there and was very interesting for me. So just to sum up, there seemed to be a tension between beliefs and practices. So people's beliefs were very, very ingrained and their practices were playing catch up, basically. In terms of the emotional aspect, there was a lot of anxiety, there was a lack of confidence, and this seemed to be linked to the idea of teacher authority in the eyes of the students. So just as a final concluding remark, I want to say that using students L1 in the classroom is not a simple matter of choice, but is instead a complex, dynamic process of social interaction that involves the whole identity of the language teacher as a psychological, ideological, emotional, and social being. Okay, thank you very much if you watched through this far. If all goes to plan, hopefully I'll be online and available to ask questions. If not, I'll put my email address on the next slide and feel free to contact me at any time about any of this. Okay, thank you very much for listening.